Master the silence. Stoic techniques to win arguments effortlessly. Yet you remained calm, composed, and unshaken? What if I told you that the true key to winning any argument doesn't lie in outshouting your opponent or being the loudest in the room? It's not in spewing the most facts, but in something far more powerful. Silence. Think about this. What if the moment you stopped trying to prove your point was the moment you gained control? The more you speak, the more they push back, trying to outdo you with words, accusations, and frustration. But if you hold your tongue, the power shifts. Your silence can make them question their own logic and even their very foundation. It's like a pressure cooker, and the more they boil with emotion, the more their argument collapses under its own weight. What if, in the most intense moments, you could walk away the victor, without saying a single word? Let's explore how the ancient wisdom of Stoicism can teach us how to stay in control of every conversation and ultimately win, without raising your voice. In the chaos of an argument, there's one weapon far stronger than any well-constructed counterpoint: your calm. In the eyes of the Stoics, emotions are like the waves of the sea, unpredictable, forceful, and often overwhelming. But they also understood that the wise person does not react to the storm. Instead, they anchor themselves in their own mind, unshaken by the external chaos. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor philosopher, once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." What does this mean for us in the heat of an argument? It means that the moment you allow your emotions to govern your actions, you've surrendered your strength. You've given control to the other person. When the other person begins to lose control, to shout, to resort to emotional pleas rather than reasoned discourse, you must remain rooted. Their emotional outbursts reveal weakness, not strength. And this is where your advantage lies. Every time they escalate, they expose themselves. Their desperation is apparent to everyone around them. They may try to twist your words to make you react, but by staying calm, you give them nothing to push against. Their power, like a raging fire, is extinguished the moment you choose not to feed it. Seneca once reflected, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." When they shout, when their emotions run wild, it is the imagination of their victory that fuels them. But the Stoic knows better. You do not need to prove yourself to them or to the world. The victory is in your response, or lack thereof. By choosing not to engage in their emotional turmoil, you force them to deal with their own frustration. Your silence becomes a mirror reflecting their chaos back onto them, while you remain untouched, solid as a mountain. And in this way you shift the balance. The conversation, once dominated by emotion, now bends toward reason. You've won. Not by overpowering them with words, but by remaining steadfast in your composure. Imagine this. You're in the middle of an argument and your opponent starts launching accusations, pointing out your flaws, trying to push you into a defensive position. Most people in these moments feel the urge to explain themselves, to justify their actions, to prove their stance. But in doing so, they've already surrendered control of the conversation. You're no longer in charge. Your opponent is. But the Stoic response is different. As Epictetus wisely said, we cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. Instead of falling into the trap of defense, take control by doing the unexpected. Ask questions. Sharp, well-placed questions don't just demand answers. They force your opponent to question their own reasoning. Instead of reacting to their attack, you place the burden of proof on them. Their logic, their arguments, and their assumptions will begin to unravel as they are made to explain themselves. With every question, you guide them to expose the weaknesses in their own position, and before they know it, they are no longer defending their point. They are scrambling to justify themselves. Think of it as a chess game. A chess master does not react to every move with haste. He waits for his opponent to overextend, to make a mistake, and then he strikes with precision. When you ask the right questions, you let them make their own mistakes. The more they speak, the more they reveal the inconsistencies in their argument, and ultimately they will defeat themselves. Marcus Aurelius also taught us to accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart. In arguments, this wisdom can be applied in a subtle yet powerful way, by acknowledging the validity in what others say, even while asking them to elaborate. You guide the conversation not by pushing your point forward, but by gently turning the conversation toward their own contradictions. Remember, the quieter you are, the sharper your questions, the more you control the direction of the discussion. The person who can question their opponent without raising their voice or defending their own position is the one who holds the upper hand. You are not drawn into their argument. You are in charge of the battlefield of logic. In the realm of argument and discourse, silence is often the most powerful weapon at your disposal. It is not an absence of response. Rather, it is a strategic and calculated tool that forces your opponent to confront their own thoughts. The Stoics understood the power of silence in a way that few do today. As Epictetus stated, "Let silence be your goal, except when speaking is more valuable." In other words, there is a time to speak, but there is also immense strength in knowing when to remain silent. Silence does something profound. It creates discomfort. When someone is in the heat of an argument, they expect resistance, a pushback, a rebuttal. But when you do nothing, when you simply remain calm, unwavering, and silent, it unsettles them. They are left with no foothold, no space in which to push their argument forward. The tension grows, and with it, their uncertainty. This is where the Stoic art of detachment comes into play. When you refuse to engage emotionally, you deny your opponent the satisfaction of a reaction. In the absence of your response, they begin to question themselves. Did I miss something? Did they know something I don't? Is my argument falling apart without me even realizing it? Silence forces them to do all the talking, filling the empty space with their own contradictions and self-doubt. The more they speak, the more they expose their weaknesses. In these moments, the Stoic mind remains calm and composed, waiting for the perfect moment to speak. Not in haste, but with purpose. Let me share a story that illustrates this power. A man I know, let's call him Thomas, was once involved in a heated debate with a colleague who was determined to prove him wrong. The colleague, frantic and aggressive, tried to bait Thomas into responding. He ranted, interrupted, and repeated himself over and over. But Thomas, instead of reacting, remained silent, his face calm and unreadable. Slowly, his colleague began to falter. His words grew less confident, his arguments began to sound repetitive. The more he spoke, the less sure of himself he seemed. By the time Thomas finally did speak, his colleague had already disarmed himself. The silence had done the work. Stoicism teaches us that silence is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It allows you to remain in control without engaging in the turmoil. The key is to resist the urge to fill every silence with words. Instead, let your calm and composure work their magic. Let the silence hang heavy, allowing your opponent to question themselves. In practice, here's how you use this strategy. When you feel the urge to respond, pause. Let the silence linger for a moment longer than is comfortable. Use steady eye contact to communicate your unshakable calm. Watch as the other person struggles, their certainty eroding with every passing second of quiet. When you finally do speak, your words will have far more weight, for they will be heard by someone who has already begun to doubt their own position. One of the most powerful tools in any debate or argument is the ability to agree with your opponent. Not because they are right, but because you understand the strategic advantage it brings. The Stoics were not rigid in their thinking. They were open to reason, adaptable in their methods, and wise enough to know that flexibility in an argument is far more powerful than stubbornness. As Marcus Aurelius said, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." Imagine you're in a debate and your opponent brings up a point that has merit. The natural response for most is to immediately counter, to defend their position at all costs. But this only heightens the tension. When you agree with part of their argument, you disarm them. They expect resistance, they expect you to challenge everything they say. But when you say, that's a fair point, you surprise them and the entire energy of the debate shifts. By acknowledging the truth in their position, you not only defuse their aggression but also position yourself as reasonable and open-minded. But this is where the Stoic twist comes in. Once you've agreed, you don't surrender your point of view. Instead, you redirect the conversation, guiding it toward your perspective in a way that feels collaborative rather than combative. This is the essence of Stoic diplomacy. You don't need to fight to prove your point. Instead, by acknowledging the valid aspects of the other person's stance, you create space to introduce your own thoughts in a more receptive atmosphere. You're not in opposition, you're in dialogue. And in dialogue, there is far more room for influence than in a battle of wills. Take the story of a woman I know. Let's call her Laura. Laura was debating a colleague about the logistics of an upcoming project. Her colleague brought up a valid concern about efficiency, something Laura had been considering as well. Instead of pushing back against the point, she said, "That's a good observation. I agree, efficiency is crucial." Her colleague, now feeling heard, softened his stance. But Laura didn't stop there. She continued, "However, I think we can streamline things without sacrificing quality. What if we combine your approach with mine to ensure both goals are met?" By agreeing first, Laura opened the door to collaboration, ultimately guiding the conversation toward a solution that benefited both of them. The Stoics understood that strength lies in flexibility. You don't need to be rigid in your thinking. Instead, acknowledge what is true in the other person's position, and then gently steer the conversation toward your own perspective. When you do this, you transform the argument into a constructive discussion, and the person you're speaking with is far more likely to listen. In real life, this strategy works best when you find common ground. Even in the most heated debates, there is always something of value in the other person's point of view. Acknowledge it, then redirect the conversation in a way that aligns with your perspective. By doing this, you'll be seen as reasonable, and the conversation will unfold in your favor. One of the most underutilized strategies in argumentation is allowing your opponent to defeat themselves. The Stoics knew that not every conflict needed to be confronted head-on. Instead, they understood that sometimes the best way to win is to allow the other person to expose their own contradictions. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, wisely stated, "Better to trip with the feet than with the tongue." This means that those who speak carelessly often end up stumbling over their own words, and by stepping back, you let them reveal their own weaknesses. When someone is caught up in their emotions or arguments, they tend to make statements without fully considering their implications. In these moments, if you allow them to continue speaking without interruption, they will inevitably contradict themselves. They will overstate their case, exaggerate their points, and expose holes in their logic. The more they talk, the deeper they dig their own hole, and the more they reveal the flaws in their own argument. This is where your role becomes that of the patient observer. Rather than jumping in to correct every flaw or to defend yourself against each point, you allow the conversation to unfold, knowing that your opponent is slowly walking into a trap of their own making. As the Stoics believed, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. In this case, their own words become the obstacles they must navigate. Consider the story of a man I know. Let's call him Eric. Eric was engaged in a heated debate with a friend who was convinced that his business idea was unworkable. Instead of defending his position, Eric simply asked questions, probing for more details. "Why do you think that? Can you explain that a little further?" As his friend continued, Eric remained quiet, listening intently. In the process, his friend contradicted himself. First claiming that the market was too small, then later arguing that the competition was too high. Eric didn't have to argue. He simply pointed out the contradiction. So, is the market too small or is the competition too high? because it can't be both. In that moment, his friend realized his argument didn't hold up. Eric had won not by defending himself, but by letting his friend talk himself into a corner. The beauty of this Stoic approach is in the power of restraint. By resisting the urge to interrupt or correct, you allow the other person to reveal their weaknesses. You allow them to expose the cracks in their own logic, and when the time comes, you simply highlight the inconsistency. There is no need for a battle. The victory is already in their words. To apply this in real life, first, resist the impulse to interrupt. Let your opponent talk freely. The more they talk, the more they reveal. Second, listen closely. Your job is not to think of your next counter-argument, but to spot the contradictions in their reasoning. Finally, when the moment is right, ask a simple, clear question that makes them face their own inconsistency. You don't need to attack them directly. Let their own words work against them. Remember, sometimes the best way to win an argument is to say nothing at all. Let them reveal their flaws with their own words, and then calmly point out the contradictions they have created. One of the most effective ways to win an argument is to refuse to engage emotionally with your opponent. This is where the wisdom of the Stoics truly shines. They understood that emotional reactions only serve to destabilize us, pulling us into a whirlwind of reaction and frustration. In his meditations, Marcus Aurelius reflects, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." In other words, by lowering yourself to their level, you forfeit your dignity and control. The Stoic response, therefore, is not to engage with their emotions, but to maintain your detachment, your clarity, and your peace. The essence of this tactic is recognizing when your opponent is trying to provoke you. Emotional arguments are designed to pull you into the storm, to get a reaction out of you that will make you lose your composure. Once you take the bait, you lose. The moment you react emotionally, you've allowed them to control you. But when you remain detached, calm, and composed, you strip them of their power. When you don't take the bait, you frustrate your opponent. They become desperate to provoke a response from you. The more they try, the more they expose their own instability. Your silence, your calmness, becomes a mirror reflecting their chaos back onto them. And this is how you remain in control. Take the story of a man I know, let's call him Kevin. Kevin had a coworker who always tried to provoke him. Whenever they disagreed, his colleague would raise his voice, throw sarcastic remarks, and try to make Kevin look bad in front of others. But Kevin, rather than rising to the bait, remained calm. He answered logically with a steady tone and sometimes even with a smile. His coworker grew increasingly frustrated, trying harder and harder to provoke a reaction. But Kevin didn't play along. Eventually, his coworker's lack of control became painfully obvious to everyone around them, and Kevin emerged from the argument not just unscathed but victorious. The Stoics teach us that we do not win by sinking to the level of our opponents. We win by remaining unmoved, by refusing to let their emotional chaos sway us. When you meet anger with calmness, when you respond to provocation with peace, you not only maintain control of the situation, you gain the respect of those observing. In practice, how do you master this? First, recognize the bait. When someone pushes your buttons, remind yourself that it's a trap. Second, remain calm. Respond with logic, not emotion. If they shout, lower your voice. If they try to provoke you, stay neutral. Finally, let them exhaust themselves. The more they try to manipulate you and fail, the weaker they appear. By staying detached, you hold the upper hand. You let them waste their energy while you conserve yours. And in doing so, you emerge the victor, not by fighting, but by choosing to remain above the fray. In the art of argument, sometimes less is more. The power of brevity in discourse is often underestimated, yet it is one of the most effective techniques you can wield in any debate. The Stoics knew the importance of simplicity and directness. As Epictetus taught, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. When you speak clearly, confidently, and concisely, you embody the strength of your position, allowing it to stand on its own. Most people, when they feel the need to defend their point, over-explain. They add layers of reasoning, they elaborate endlessly, trying to convince others with more words, more facts, and more details. But in doing so, they give their opponent more ammunition. Every additional word becomes an opportunity for their argument to be twisted, questioned, or attacked. But the Stoic knows that the true strength of an argument lies not in how much you say, but in how effectively you make your point. A well-placed statement, made with confidence and clarity, is far more powerful than 1,000 words of explanation. When you state your point briefly, you force the other person to engage with the substance of your argument, not the quantity of your words. Think of it as throwing a stone into a pond. You don't need to throw 100 stones to make an impact. One well-placed stone with precision and confidence is all that is needed to create ripples. In the same way, your argument should be concise and strong. When you state your point and then remain silent, you leave your opponent with nothing to counter. They are left to ponder your words, struggling to find a rebuttal, while you stand firm, composed, and confident. Consider the story of a man I know. Let's call him Jason. Jason was in a debate with his boss about a new system that Jason believed would improve workplace efficiency. His boss was skeptical and raised several objections. Rather than defending each point, Jason simply said, "We can run a trial. If it works, we keep it. If it doesn't, we discard it. No risk." And then he stopped talking. His boss sat there silent. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to elaborate on. The simplicity and confidence of Jason's statement left no room for further opposition. After a brief pause, his boss finally said, "Fine, let's try it." Jason had won, not by over-explaining, but by making his point clearly and confidently. The Stoic approach is simple. State your argument briefly and then let it settle. Allow the silence to follow your words, giving them time to sink in. In this space, your confidence shines and your opponent is left scrambling for a counterpoint. When you speak with clarity and then remain silent, your words carry weight, because you have nothing more to prove. To apply this strategy in real life, first, make your point clear and direct. No extra fluff, no unnecessary details. Second, stop talking. Let the silence create space for your argument to be fully absorbed. Finally, hold your ground. Don't feel the need to explain or justify. When you trust in the strength of your point, you leave no room for doubt. One of the most important skills in any argument is knowing when to walk away. In the heat of a debate, it's easy to get caught up in the need to win, to prove that your point is correct. But the Stoics understood the value of peace over pointless conflict. As Epictetus wisely said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." When someone is unwilling to listen, when they are entrenched in their own opinions, no amount of reason or logic will change their mind. So why waste your energy? Sometimes the best way to win an argument is to refuse to engage in it at all. When someone is only looking to feed their ego, to seek validation rather than truth, engaging with them only gives them what they want. They are not interested in dialogue. They are interested in dominating the conversation and asserting control. The Stoic approach is to refuse to play their game. When you recognize that an argument is going nowhere, that the other person is not open to reasoning, you choose peace over battle. You walk away. You deny them the satisfaction of a reaction. In doing so, you not only preserve your energy but also frustrate the manipulator. Nothing is more infuriating to a person looking for a fight than someone who refuses to engage. Consider the story of a man I know. Let's call him Ben. Ben had a coworker who thrived on arguments. No matter the topic, his colleague always had to be right, and no matter how sound Ben's reasoning was, his coworker was always combative. One day, during yet another pointless back and forth, Ben realized something. His colleague wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for control. So Ben did something different. Instead of continuing the argument, he simply said, "You might be right," and walked away. His colleague was left speechless. No argument, no validation, just an empty space where the fight was supposed to be. Ben had won. Not by proving himself right, but by choosing not to engage. The Stoics teach us that not every argument is worth fighting. Wisdom lies not in the ability to argue, but in knowing when to walk away. As Marcus Aurelius said, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. If you allow yourself to get caught up in pointless debates, you risk losing your peace. Your tranquility is more valuable than any fleeting victory in a conversation. In practice, how do you apply this? First, ask yourself, does this argument have a purpose? If the other person is unwilling to listen, then there is no value in continuing. Second, assess their intentions. Are they seeking truth or just control? If they are seeking to dominate, walk away. Finally, remember that your peace is priceless. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is to refuse to engage. By choosing peace over conflict, you not only preserve your energy but also deny your opponent the reaction they crave. You remain in control, not by winning the argument but by choosing not to participate in it. There is a profound strength in silence, a force often underestimated. The Stoics knew this well, understanding that the loudest voice is rarely the most powerful. Rather than continuously battling to assert your position, sometimes the most effective move is to sit back and allow your opponent to expose their own flaws. The art of quiet victory is exactly this. Letting your opponent reveal the contradictions and weaknesses in their argument without lifting a finger. In every debate, we tend to think that our victory is determined by how many facts we can present, how loudly we can speak, or how many arguments we can make. But the Stoic philosophy teaches us a different lesson. Victory is not about dominating the conversation, it's about mastering ourselves. About remaining unaffected by the emotional chaos around us. As Epictetus said, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. In arguments, it's not the other person's words that have power over us, but our own emotional responses. When you stop reacting, when you refuse to be disturbed by the storm of words, you gain control. You become the calm in the center of the chaos, and this is where true power lies. There's a story I know of a man named Thomas who was involved in a heated debate with a colleague. The colleague was yelling, trying to prove a point with frustration and emotion. Thomas, instead of reacting or defending himself, simply sat back and listened. Each word from his colleague became more frantic, more desperate, but Thomas remained silent. The more his colleague ranted, the more obvious it became to everyone around them that the argument lacked substance. By the time Thomas responded, his colleague had already disarmed himself. Thomas didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise his voice. His silence had already won the battle. This is the ultimate Stoic lesson. Silence is not weakness. It is strength. When you refuse to engage in emotional turmoil, you force your opponent to expose their insecurities, their contradictions, and their flaws. When they're left with nothing to fight against, they crumble under the weight of their own words. And that, my friends, is where true victory lies. Not in shouting the loudest, but in holding your ground with quiet strength. In practice, here's how you can use this technique. First, remember that silence is not your enemy. In fact, it is your ally. When the other person is speaking passionately, do not rush to interrupt or prove them wrong. Second, allow them to exhaust themselves. The longer they speak, the more they reveal. Finally, when you do speak, make it count. Your words will be far more powerful after the silence, for they will be the only solid ground amidst the emotional storm. In every debate, there lies an opportunity, not just to win the argument, but to master the art of restraint, the strength of silence, and the power of your own mind. The Stoics understood that true victory is not in outshouting or overpowering your opponent, but in holding your ground and remaining composed while others lose themselves in emotion and confusion. By employing these techniques, strategic silence, calmness, and the ability to question rather than defend, you shift the balance of power in every argument, turning it into a quiet victory. But remember, the key to these methods is practice. It's one thing to know the Stoic principles. It's another to embody them in the heat of a real conversation. It takes time, patience, and self-discipline to stay detached, to let others reveal their own contradictions, and to choose peace over conflict. But once you master this art, no argument will ever throw you off balance again. You will control the room without raising your voice, without making your point the loudest, but with the calm confidence of a true Stoic. Now, I encourage you to apply these principles in your own life. The next time you're faced with a heated argument, remember, you don't have to fight to win. You just need to remain calm, ask the right questions, and let silence do its work. Mastering this art doesn't just make you a better debater. It makes you a better, more composed person, capable of navigating even the most chaotic situations with ease. If you found these insights valuable, I encourage you to hit that like button, comment below with your thoughts, and share this video with anyone who could benefit from learning the power of silence in arguments. And if you want more powerful strategies for mastering the mind, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for future videos. Thank you for watching. Let's continue learning and growing together, mastering not just our arguments but ourselves.